Welcome back to Let's Combinate, everybody, where we are mastering pharma and medical device quality little q. Today, we're joined by Dr. Timothy Ongst. He's the visionary behind the digital Apothecary. Tim is a pharmacist, professor, and digital health expert who's evaluated over 5,000 mobile health apps and has become a leading voice in how technology is transforming pharmacy, pharma, and healthcare. In today's discussion, I hope to dive into his work with digital therapeutics, smart drug delivery devices, the thing that we care a lot about in combination products, as well as wearable technology and how all of that is reshaping healthcare. We'll hopefully discuss also the evolving role of pharmacists in a tech-driven healthcare world, where he sees the future of health heading. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, thank you for having me. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, you have different vantage points just based on your background. Now, I want to I want to dive into what I think is like really the $1 million question, at least for me as a normie who has no real experience in the digital health space, and that is like focusing on pharma first. There's
Hmm.
a lot of talk about the quote unquote digital transformation. And
Yeah.
I've seen that terminology be used for a bunch of different things, whether it's like having smart pills or wearables that do whatever, or but I've also seen it used for like ERP systems and tracking. And so, is it just this giant term that is bereft of meaning and like anything with a computer is considered digital transformation, or like how do you constrain it?
That's a great question because we had the World Health Organization actually finally putting out like an infographic on what they consider digital transformation. That one's been fun. So I think for me, what I look at it is when we talk about transformation is temporal compared to wherever you are in society, life, and culture. Man probably was digging worms out of the ground, eating it, and then lightning strikes around and causes fire and freaks them out, right? And then we discover and we actually make fire. We can. And when I look at this, I think what people talk about digital transformation, there's three things that they actually are talking about. One is digitalization, cook stuff. That's great. Is that a transformation? Probably. And then there's digitalization, and then there's digital transformation. So the way I look at digitalizing something is basically going from an analog format to a digital format. For us in pharmacy, that would be like the idea of taking a physical written prescription and instead turning it into electronic prescription. And there's been immense benefits around that in terms of just electronic prescriptions. Now patients don't lose it. We would get prescriptions that are dirty, have blood on them, passed to me, and we never like that. But along with that, then is you can send multiple prescriptions at once. All these other things, easier for billing, easier for record keeping, blah blah blah. Then you go through this whole how do we then think about digitalization? How do we change stuff? And I always go back to like banking and this whole question around digital health. Like everyone sees digital health, and that's just an umbrella term at the end of the day. FDA has some definitions that finally put out in glossary and such, but the reality is like I'm a firm believer digital health eventually just becomes health. Like it's just a temporal term that we've adopted. Take for point, no one calls it digital banking. Like you just have an app that can cash checks that you can make payments on. You can scan your phone. You go back 20 years, people were still using checkbooks. We still now have, I have students who are coming to me that don't even know how to use a checkbook. The idea of balancing your account is, gone. So what happened? You went through 20 years of just changes of industry. And I think that's where in healthcare we are. So digitalization turns into like this whole conversation of how do we start thinking about, and I think where this conversation comes up for us is like, in the past, then you would ask people keep a log of people taking their medications. Now we can add sensors that can detect how they're taking their medications in real time and using them. That's great because we never had that kind of aspect in the past because of bias, subjective measurements, points, and etc. Then you reach a final point, which is this whole thing called digital transformation, which I think for that conversation turns into like how do we take everything that we're doing and transform what we're doing in care. And to me, this is probably where I have seen the biggest failures around digital health is that most people understand how to digitalize something. Most people understand how to then transform that a little bit into digitalization and take it to another process. Very few have tackled, I think, digital transformation outright, thinking about how do we revamp care. Like telehealth to me is not a digital transformation. That's just changing the process at the end of the day. There's nothing else that's new in terms of actually providing care that's transformative around how we do things. At the end, we're still ordering the same tests. We're still doing the same prescriptions. We're still think just the interactions and the means has changed. So I would say probably the biggest digital transformation that has probably occurred at one point would have been the development and push to electronic health records, because that has changed substantially how we envision providing and documenting and recording and even working up our patients. And that can still always improve depending on what we add onto it. So I know this is a long answer to your question, but to me, like I hear this talk a lot, and to me, I'll summarize it. It's a temporal relationship to what's going on at the time, and along with is that it's very much step mediated. And lastly, it really requires, I think, a huge task of retraining and redeveloping and redeploying how you do X. In this case, when we talk about healthcare, there's different things that we could choose to do there, but like that's probably where we're at right now.
And so just dive, because I completely understand what the point about digital transformation means, basically actually something changing by the way that you're going about doing it. Therefore, like telehealth, like just doing something remotely or electronically that you would have done in person, from your point of view, isn't like really a transformation.
Yeah.
Whereas something like the EHR stuff, it's something that started as, yes, now we're doing the thing electronically that we weren't before, but that's actually changing how we're doing the healthcare providing part as well. The first two, though, I couldn't make out the difference. It was digitalization versus
So
digitization.
they sound almost exactly the same. So
Digitization.
digitization is going to be going from analog to a digital format. So
Yeah.
you're no longer taking Polaroid prints. Like you're taking pictures with your smartphone. Digitalization then is going to the next level. Now you have things that are digital, how to use them differently. So now your photos, instead of having a photo album, now it can be stored in the cloud. Now all those photos can be shared on social media. Now those photos can be shared as ID. Now those photos, you see what I'm saying, like that. Like
Sure.
once you get to that digital phase, then you can start redoing things differently. And I think transformation has always occurred in different industries at different levels. I think self-driving cars, if we ever get to that level, would be like a digital transformation, because we would have to rethink the whole aspect of transportation and what that means, and like how do insurance companies handle it? How does regulations come in and handle it? How does basically the whole premise, like, do you and me still need driver's license in 50 years if we get self-driving cars? Will you have to sit behind and help your child when they turn 16 to learn how to drive? Or is that out the window? And that's just like, oh, old people used to do this, right? And I think that's what it comes back down to, is like I talk about like the EHR, like I don't have to teach my students how to physically document these days. We talk more about like, oh, like smart sheets and everything else. Like, yeah, you hit these codes and it will help draft your documentation for the day. That's what they know. So like if they see anything like old school and like talk about, oh, pull up the medication administration report. Like, what's that? What's all these tick boxes? Oh, that's when the nurses physically gave the medication to the patient. Like, what do you mean? And it's like, that's how it was. So I think that's one aspect that comes down that's really fascinating right now, is because things are changing very quickly.
Yeah, I wonder what a stop sign would look like for if you had self-driving cars everywhere. You consult and are on advisory boards with a lot of big pharma companies and pharmaceutical companies. How are they approaching the digital transformation, and are there things that you're seeing across the board where like industry is moving towards a new quote unquote state of the art, to use like that terminology? Is there an area where digital is changing around all of pharma?
Mhm. I think those are good questions. So for me, where I look at it is, yeah, I think any business right now understands that they have to have some kind of digital strategy at play. And now we have a whole
Actually,
experience.
well, why is that? Why do you have to have a digital strategy?
I think it's expectation. I
You
think
think so?
there's, yeah, I think the whole idea is that you'll have to scale things up. I think meeting where people where they're at. Like, I'll take a step back and talk about even like the business of pharmacy and getting medications. I don't think in 30 years or 20 years someone's going to be on their iPhone 35 in a drive-through waiting to get their prescription. Like, what kind of world do you expect in 20 years when everything else has changed? When our children are going through immense changes as well. Where I'm an older millennial, and I know my
Same.
expectations right now. I expect to be in an old folks' home at some point in VR, at least minimally, right? I expect to be talking with friends that are older adults, like, hey, do you remember when GTA 3 came out and we like would do all this stuff? That's so it's like I always hear people say like, "Oh, we're gonna treat people like they're older adults and they're gonna be like the same way they were back in the '60s." That's not gonna be the case. You and I know that, and I think it's like it's the expectation of, well, healthcare has to follow the whims and desires of society as a whole. And I think what turns into is this consumer mentality has really adopted across everything. And the whole idea of I want it now, I want the data now, I want what's going on with me now, even if it's not in your face, but passively in the background, many things. Like that's your expectations. Like no one's going into home economics and being handed a physical checkbook and saying debit and credit and balance that out. Like you don't do that. Like you expect something else to take that on for you. And I think healthcare as it stands is turning into a place where many people look at it and say, why can't I get this problem solved now? What is my problem? How do I solve it? How do I get there? And that changing perception, everyone then has to gravitate towards it, wherever they are on that spectrum, whether you're a direct patient facing role or you're adjuncted to that. If you're anywhere in there, that changing demand by that patient that exists in society, that I think calls in that digital strategy to some level to be part of it. Because if healthcare, we are going digital, and we are with our data and our approaches and stuff like that, I think everyone else has to look and say, if I'm not on that boat, then where am I? Do I expect it to go by me, or am I going to play catch up? And I think that has come down to different strategies. Is like, let some people experiment and fail, and we'll learn from them. Let us take the lead and race ahead and outpace everyone else, or we'll keep par with what our competitors are doing. And every pharma company has a different strategy, and every pharma company has different pipelines, and every disease has different needs. When we talk about healthcare, is one thing; it's not one topic. I think that's where people get caught up. Is like talking about inflammatory conditions. Okay, which one? You want to talk like is type 1 an autoimmune condition? Yeah. Then you got one company actually looking at this. Is IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, is that one? Yeah. Multiple sclerosis. Do we want to throw that in there? Autoimmune cancers. Are we now redirecting it towards that? And suddenly you involve different specialties, different people with different trainings, different people with different approaches. And so, for I think a huge fallacy has been trying to treat healthcare as this one aspect that's been practiced, and that's not the case. We're not a science directly. We're very much still an art in how we do things on the ground. It's a mixture of science and art. We would love to be more scientific, but we need much more data to handle that and to go towards that objective kind of area. And there's some practices where we have that are, I think, vastly changing right now, like psych. Like the whole idea, like what is depression? Can we measure depression? Can we measure pain? Can we quantify these things? Can we get to a point? Can we rethink about like outcomes instead of just thinking about like, the DSM-5 questionnaire that you throw people and saying this makes sense or this doesn't make sense? So towards your question about this whole digitalization, I would say the desire there is to keep a pace with how society is moving. I don't see a society short of something very bad happening, something diminishing and abandoning technology at some level of playing a core role. No one's going to give up Uber Eats. No one's going to give up delivering Amazon. No one's going to give up these things. But I think the door opens and you demand more. Like, I want my medication now. Have a drone deliver it to me. I want my prescription now. I want this now. I want this pain to go away. I want this cancer fixed as fast as possible. I don't want to go to a nursing home. I don't want to get my blood pressure taken like this, or I can inject it and take out my blood. Hell, if you tell me I have a smart toilet and I can urinate it and you can give me a basic metabolic panel and it's passively in there, that'd be great, right? Because it's a passive component of my life now. And I don't have to cognitively think about my suffering and I have a disease and I am tied to a medication or treatment or anything else like that. It's just a part of life. And
Yeah,
so that's going to be my outlook, and that's what I've always been steering towards. Is like how do we drive towards that point in healthcare and develop around that kind of angle?
sure. And I'm glad you painted that broad brush because the sort of thought experiment is one that I really haven't done in any level of like meditative detail, but like the thought of like being a 70 or 80-year old on a VR and like it's never something that I thought about. Like in my head, I'm like, I'm just gonna become an old guy who knows how to use a smartphone. It wasn't like maybe the experience is gonna be different than before. Even though the experience now for someone older in a facility like that is different than it was 50 or 100 years ago. It's just a matter of like, at least for me, you never put yourself in the driver's seat of those situations of like, what would it actually be like? So I think it's a real interesting thought experiment. Now, in terms of like the baseline, like, so I think the argument that you presented of is very clear of digital strategies. You just need to decide, are you going to be leading or are you going to be leading from behind, however you want to frame it. But there is no situation where you're not doing one of the other. Like you have to do something to be still on the boat, I think is what you said. But so in terms of just painting
Mm.
pharma as a whole, are there certain things that are changing across the board where it's like, okay, this is a shift now?
Actually, I think we could pause there because I don't think even directly in a company there's going to be like a digital strategy people say like this is a pillar for us or this is like an area for us to focus. That's fine.
Yeah.
But I think depending on which division or branch of that pharma tree you're on, even internally in a company, there could be different pushes for it, dependent on again like what molecule you're playing with, what disease are you tackling. Some areas I think would be a much higher focus than others because there is a greater aspect to using some kind of digital tool that could help really go faster. And I'll pick on diabetes. Like diabetes, like we think now automatically like CGM as this like huge thing, right? So if you're a company in the diabetes space, like that's gonna be it. But if your company also deals with another space within, that may not be the big focus because you're like, what's this? What's the equivalent of CGM within us? Nothing. Okay, what can we do? So it. I think when I even look at individual diseases, like some are much further ahead than others. And that's going to really dictate what support and what drive within that individual company they're going to push if they want to have a digital strategy. So I think digital strategy could be as an organization whole and then can break down to micro silos or different aspects. Like this one needs much more focus because this makes sense versus we don't even have data anywhere to start here. And we have to either format that or develop that. And does that align with what we as a business want to accomplish in the future? So I think there's different levels even within a singular organization about what they want to do with that. That
No,
would be my caveat there.
totally understand. I think the thing that, like, as an engineer, particularly when you're working on, say, devices, is you're used to like the touch and feel of things, right? Like you're making an actual thing. And just so you understand, like, one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you is because I feel like digital health conceptually is talked about as like in the abstract of
Mm-hmm.
like, what about this and what about that, and like, wouldn't it be great if we had democratized clinical trials or electronic this, or like you said,
Yes.
the smart toilet is the one that I haven't heard before, but I like it. But like, in terms of like what is actually going on, it's hard for at least me to put a finger on it. So
Mm-hmm.
like, are there things like clinical trials or manufacturing or something like that where you're seeing like a clear trend?
No, I don't think so. I don't think there's one
There's
pathway
no
that
one.
makes sense to this all. I think a lot. I think the 2020s are still building up. Like the 2010s that we established, is this feasible and this not a fad? And we haven't replaced a smartphone or that kind of medium or like or ways that we're currently doing things. So
Mm,
for right now, I think we're in this phase. So very much then technology is still like a focal point in your face. In the event, I think companies now this decade have established where is it worthwhile spending time, and I think a lot of them have come down to like we need to finesse like individual area things. Like we can't stop just medication adherence stuff and all this stuff. Like that doesn't
mm.
mean everything for this. Like, do we need to measure like you swallowing a statin every day? Probably not. I don't think it's there. So like there's things that make sense and some things that don't make sense. And I think that's where companies had to take a step back and say, yeah, we have enough money, we can play around this, but what's going to help us at the end of the day? Whether it's going to be research, R&D, development, or is it going to be coming down to, is this going to help out with our medical teams? Is this going to help out our commercial? Is this going to help us accomplish what's needed for regulatory? So many things to turn into, well, are we going to use this adjunctive to what we're currently doing, and it's going to help us in terms of like supplanting or like replacing things? I don't think we're quite there yet. And I think one thing I had to throw back, and this comes just even from like working clinical, is that companies can come out with whatever they want, but if the current providers and the workforce isn't ready for it, there's only so far you can get with direct to consumer market at the end of the day, especially with this. Like, so if you want to get that technology covered by a payer who will then cover it, so that when the provider prescribes it, the patient can actually get it and utilize it. There's going to be a lot of work there, and there's going to have to be a lot of buy-in, and there's a lot of biases that still hover over us about the use of technology in healthcare. And it comes down to is what is the value proposition at the end of the day, and that value proposition varies, I think, immensely across multiple stakeholders. Adherence for a patient means very different for adherence for a payer, means very different for adherence to pharmacy, adherence to wholesaler, adherence to payer, adherence to the clinician. Like, adherence means very many different things for all those different groups, and having like one product solves all those issues or those wants and desires, I don't think is feasible as it currently stands, at least granularly. Like, I think you start looking at what kind of things, who's going to pay for it, who's going to want it, and why would they want it. And having that aha moment pop up has been very tough, I think, with this.
Now, related to that, you've done a lot of work in the kind of drug delivery space. And so, how have you seen the evolution of drug delivery devices, things like smart inhalers, wearable injectors, multi use injectors, and things like that in improving treatment adherence? I think now we're diving into combination products in a little
Yep.
bit more detail. It's like your point. Everybody talks about like adherence as this like the thing that's very clearly something that is of such huge value. What ends up happening, like in the people who actually have worked in combination products, is you try and slap a digital thing on something that hasn't been digital before, and you end up seeing either issues in terms of implementation, like you said, the doctor and the payer needs to be ready for it, or issues in like, oh, now this thing that all I had to do was twist the knob and press a button has a screen on it, and I have to like follow the instructions and click a touch screen, and now I have to reload and unload a cartridge and store the drug differently than the device and charge it or whatever. Like, now it adds a lot more complexity. And in some cases, I like to use this terminology of juice to squeeze ratio. And so you have to decide. And so I think you see some companies who were gung ho about having a digital element to something that wasn't before backpedal and say maybe the use case isn't there. It's there for something else.
Yeah. So one thing, and this is probably one thing that stood out to me, is what molecule are you tying this to? I have definitely seen, like, one thing that comes up to me is if you choose a drug that is second line therapy in standard of care and put something smart on it, it's not going to suddenly consume market share. It's just not. Like, you're still going to have first line therapy be the majority of medications that are entering the
Expect
market.
can you explain, like, from a pharmacist point of view, this first line, second line? How do
Oh
you
yeah.
guys actually, how do you just going back to basics, but like I know what it means, but I've never talked to a pharmacist of like, how do you make sure that somebody qualifies for the second line before you
Oh,
disqualify them for the, because that's interesting.
okay. I think there's two aspects to this. So I'm going to come from different angles. One is a clinical aspect, and the clinical aspect could be like, if I have a drug that can, like, I'm going to focus on diabetes because I do a lot of cardiometabolic. So if I have a drug that can reduce A1C by 2% that has minimal side effects, and then I have another drug that can reduce A1C by 2% but causes you to have an increased risk of like hypoglycemia that gets hospitalization, the side effect profile diminishes that one. It may not get it off first line, but if I have another one that also has a lot of side effects and only reduce A1C by 1%, that may not be a peripheral drug, or maybe it doesn't have any benefit. A lot of our diabetes drugs these days either have microvascular or macrovascular benefits. It reduces heart attacks, reduces strokes, reduces kidney damage, reduces your risk of, like, these types of things pop up. And that, those added clinical benefits, and we'll call this under like evidence-based medicine, like these really great data points for outcomes. That's really great from a clinical standpoint because patients care about that, clinicians care about that. Here's the other person who cares about it. Your payer now cares about it. And your payer now looks at it and says, we want people on these things because if it's beneficial, then that means long total cost of care should diminish, right? Like, if I can stop my patients from going on dialysis and having to pay for that long term, and these drugs can help with that, then we should push providers to consider these drugs as first line therapy. So your second line therapy turns into like just disease oriented outcomes or things like that, maybe not as much. Or what it could be is the second line turns into, we have another drug that's comparable, but maybe it's easier to use. Like, okay, your first line therapy has to be taken 3 times a day, so adherence is difficult there, but it's pennies, but it still has good efficacy. You have another drug that comes on the market, it only has to take once a day. seeing comparable efficacy. Start the person on the cheap one first, and because efficacy is going to be similar, right? The only benefit is that perceived adherence issue. But if your patient's taking the medication, having the benefit with it, then first line therapy has accomplished what it's supposed to. That second line therapy we can then reserve is the patient says, you know what, the drugs just isn't working. Why isn't it working? I keep forgetting how to take it and everything else. I have a busy schedule. I can remember taking it once a day. I can't remember the second or evening dose. It doesn't fit my lifestyle. Then maybe we can approach and go for a second line therapy. And that could be different things. That could be having to submit like a prior authorization. It could be like other things that go into it. But the second line therapy is still there available because it does help the patient. But the efficacy hasn't changed. It's just that administration thing. So when I come back down to this like you talked about, putting sensors and stuff like that and stuff, what we have seen is like some people are targeting a medication that maybe is no longer first line therapy or maybe a second line drug and such. But like the provider's concerned about efficacy alone in this case. What has not been really think adequately done, and this goes back to a whole conversation around digital transformation, has anyone been able to really fully say my medication plus X leads to this synergistic outcome that cannot be attributed to the molecule itself, and that warrants it that we should have patients on this because it gets such much better fit for everyone involved. And I
Can you
think
give
that's the
give
goal
an
it is.
can because there are like this is not the because combination products in the way that I typically use it means drug device. But then there's
Yep.
also combination pharma products where you may have multiple molecules in the same pill or multiple
Mm.
injections used together or whatever. Like, is that what you're talking about?
Nah, so you could have like a combination product. We'll stick with like inhalers, injectables, and things like that. And so we'll stick with that language. And the other one,
Well, I was just trying to understand the point that you just made of like this plus this has this response, and then how do you make sure that's signal and not noise?
I think that's the biggest thing is it's been hard to show that. Like if I take like a medication that I inject for, I'm just gonna say diabetes that helps with weight loss, and I have one, and then I have another one that has a smart enabled onto it. Like, does that smart enable lead to better weight loss at the end of the day? Because I think the payer and everyone else is going to look at it and say, like, what does that data or that thing
Oh,
add that
you're
can
okay.
lead
So
to
you're
show you?
yeah, you're talking about things that aren't like actually the molecule, a
Yes, and I think
feature
it's all,
or
and I think it's all that digital health stuff around it. Like, and I think there's a reason why like we're seeing a rise of what's called, I think, PETers, prescription drug use related software from the FDA has started that in 2023, and like the whole now explosion with this conversation, like tying a digital therapeutic to a molecule or to a device and drug to help enable it to go towards that next level. That I think is like what people are trying to figure out, is this feasible? Does it make sense? Truly, for myself, I do think it would make sense, and I think there's different therapeutic areas it will make more sense than others right now. Um, and I think it comes down to how much data we have around certain conditions to build upon. I'll go back to diabetes. Like we have a disease that is very much objectively measured with a set data points that has been around in our lexicon for over 20 years. Like we talk about A1C, we talk about blood glucose. Patients know that, providers know that, almost everyone knows these kind of terms. And
Mhm.
patients have, like, you'd say, oh, I have to prick my finger to get measurements. Like that's always in there. I have to inject insulin. We have people tied up to do that, teach that, and facilitate it. They were like the closest to then be like, how do we think about really pushing it? And now you have conversations right around like an artificial pancreas, a closed loop system. These things got developed, like insulin pumps got developed back in the 70s, and it's taken us this long to get to this point. But it's really because we've had a lot of technology has come on board that has facilitated either hardware, software, etc. And parts of it is molecule based that has enabled us to actually get to a point where, hey, we can envision this. There's not there's some other conditions that can think that way, and there's some other conditions that are nowhere near that because they don't have that data or that kind of disease oriented approach that they can use. um, like when we talk about, like, let's say like oncology, like the big thing is like when we talk about stuff like technology around there, it's like staging, diagnostics, because so much of that has been focused on someone individually having to look at something and say, I think it's this. But as we gain better biomarkers, better digital biomarkers, even, and better ways to classify, diagnose, and do risk stratification on patients, now that conversation can now happen and go further. They've had all this data sitting there in a warehouse, right? The EHRs, all this images, MRIs, and everything else has been there. but processing it has not been easy. Like you can't hire thousands of people. There's not a lot of thousands of radiologists that are going to stand by and just go through this on their own free time. So the ROI of trying to have and like do all this stuff in research has been very limited. And now we talk about like machine learning that could have gone through all those images that have already been tagged. Like, what's this type of cancer? Now you can like start really going faster with this as we got into technology better. So there's different things that we are really like we can really go faster with. And there's some conditions that this makes sense. And other conditions, I don't know what we would change there. Like it's like then it's like there's some diseases that look like I don't know what vastly could or could not change. And that's the hard part. Is that is like what can we re-envision? What can we redo?
No, you just talked about Peters and FDA. How do you see regulatory agencies adapting as it relates to digital? Is it something that has gotten to the point where it has to be overseen from a regulatory standpoint? Or do the existing control, like for, I'll give an example. We've had connected devices before, infusion pumps and the like. Are they becoming more advanced? Certainly, but do they already have the wherewithal to evaluate and control, or is there going to be a shift, you think?
Like even talk about those like CDRH and other ones would have been looking at that, and these things have been classified as medical devices. I think for me, where I get caught up with it is that our means of even just authorizing use, whether it's a 510K clearance, whether it's going through like a de novo pathway and such, I don't know if they're going to be able to keep up with like just constantly people being bombarded. We have a new way of thinking, a new way of thinking. Like, what's the expectation? And I think regulation is going to be needed because, to put it nicely, humans are chaotic and we do things that don't make sense half the time. And we medications themselves, the old saying is the dose makes the poison. I don't think it's very hard to see like how we can have very many negative things that come out. Banking as itself still has issues that pop up all the time. And I think treatment with health with technology will also have that. Whether it's from nefarious reasons, unfortunately, or misuse or misunderstanding or improper use of stuff, I think that's stuff that has to come up. I mean, my big thing that I'm afraid of is bias of information. And I think that's one thing. Like, yes, the FDA authorizes or has put on the market medications where 95% of the population was white, and then we find out that in some other populations it doesn't work as well. That doesn't mean we remove the drugs. That just means that the people who prescribe them should know where to use those drugs or not, so that you prevent these medical misadventures and you optimize care for your population. Having these regulators and such in the background, I think, helps enforce these things and helps us protect ourselves from going back towards snake oil. That's at the end of the day has always been a thing. Healthcare is a business. It's not hard to make money if you get too much freedom from it, unfortunately. And at the end of the day, I think those of us that choose to work in healthcare, we take this as our role is to make sure and enforce that we're doing the best for our patients. I have seen proposals, I've seen ideas over the years from many different things where I just am shocked because I'm just like, this doesn't help us. Like, you'll make money, but it won't help my patients. Hell, I can see some harm coming out of this. And yet some people will still think of themselves, this is the next great thing, and throw thousands and millions of dollars at it. And then it never takes off. And we ask ourselves why. It's because I'm your barrier at the end of the day for any of your technological development. I deal with the patients. I have to live with the ethical considerations. I go to bed at night thinking to myself, did I do the best for that patient or not? That technology, if it can help me think that I did the best for them and I can provide the best care for them, that can sell me. And I think that's been the miscommunication. The hardest thing for pharma is to get that across and getting that developed. So you asked about the regulations and such. They're there to help enforce things. But I think what has to happen is this talk. And I think Peters and some of this stuff will accomplish this because I think in the background of almost every provider is going to be like, and what I hear about is it safe? Is it effective? Well, who deemed that at the end of the day? And then you think about like, okay, what's the evidence for use? What's the safety parameters? Many of our data and research coming out now about why people are scared of technology, a lot of it's fear about like, is the data safe? is this going to be fine for the patient? Why is it the patient has a negative medical event associated with this? Like how to report it? Am I held liable for this? Let's go back to adherence. So if I have a medication and patient takes it, how do I know if they take it or not? I really don't. Once you put sensors on, you can tell me they took it or not. You have opened Pandora's box, and I now know. So if the patient's supposed to take that drug once a day and they're not taking it once a day, and I know they're not taking it once a day because I have this data being fed into my EHR and I'm aware of it, and something negative happens. In the past, I wouldn't be held liable. I didn't know. I now know. Does that change my now approach to providing care? Am I going to be like tied to my computer? Am I going to be looking at these alerts, being like, oh no, a patient didn't take their medication. What do I do? This is stuff that goes through our heads.
Yeah, no, sure. And I think it goes back to the art thing that you were talking about earlier of like, as an example, label usage, for example. Pharma companies can't market off label. They can't market off label, but pharmacists or clinicians have the ability to prescribe off. Oh, actually, clinicians prescribe, right? Pharmacists don't do any prescription. Is that right? I
It
don't know.
depends
I'm
on where you
asking.
function and where you're at. Like there's actually collaborative practice, and there are some areas in the country where you can have standalone. So like for me, I used to have a collaborative practice that I could prescribe, and in my current area, I do not. So I've flip flopped throughout my career several times. But
But
like
it is possible.
yes, like you can order tests, you can interpret, you can prescribe and start medications. It depends on where you're at. So just that's yeah, you just say clinicians prescribing, you'll be fine.
Yeah. All right. As we move to close, here's a real funny closer of a question. What about AI?
Which type of AI?
Broad spectrum. You know more than me.
Oh, geez. You know what? This is my stance. The hype around this has been very difficult for me because
Hmm.
with digital health, there's always been some level of kind of like AI stuff in the background. Like your earliest digital therapies were involved with like insulin dosing back in 2014. They were using machine learning for that stuff, and the FDA cleared all those types of things, and no one like really batted an eye. And AI is goes through ups and downs, winters and springs. We're in the spring right now, and so like when people come to me and I talk about AI like it's a new thing, I'm like, you know what? Digital health AI helps supplant and like do a lot of this stuff. So it's like you provide like this great chocolate chip cookie, and you're like, all you focus upon is like that chocolate chip and what's the percent cacao? Where was it sourced from? That's just one part of this larger piece. So to me, like AI is on its own is not fun.
Mm,
It's how you use it, deliver it in a process. That's what makes it amazing to me. So it's a part of the whole thing. To me, like on its own, it's not really that cool. It's like, what can you do with it? I think that's what has been more of the hype is people say, look what AI can do. Look how we
mm,
can re-envision X. That has been like AI as a topic and being around for decades wasn't it. And I think for me right now, what it is, it turns into is like we're really having that that conversation of that transformation, really re-envisioning like what can we do that we couldn't do in the past. And in some ways, that scares us and freaks us out. And other people they look at this like this is the next big thing that we can take and go crazy with. Are we in the fourth industrial age? Like, is that what this leads to? Maybe, which is going to put us all really hard on in terms of like, what does that mean then to exist in a society where this stuff exists and that we do these things? Because the processes that we've been relied on, that we grew up on, that we have habits around, may become non-existent in the future. And that's the hard part, I think, is when, and this comes back to the original thing, like you talk about transformation. Like transformation to me is temporal to what's going on. In this case, when we talk about AI, that transformation around several things could be massive or it could be overhyped. I'm a person that looks towards the long view of things. I do think that AI plays a role for us. I don't necessarily think that in the next 2 years AI replaces everyone's jobs, replace podcasts, replace all these things. Like that's not on my radar. But like 2030s, some things will happen. By 2040s, what could happen? By 2050s, I'm retired, and what's my life going to be like then? Like there's a lot of stuff that could happen in the next 10 to 20 years that we need to really aim towards. Giving and focusing on that future, I think, is very key. So that's my answer to your AI question because I think long term in terms of like what could this mean and not necessarily the short little cool stuff that a lot of people are focused on.
Tell folks where people can find you. What are you working on? Where you at?
So you can find me at the Digital Apothecary. You'll find me basically giving keynotes, talks in the pharmacy organizations of other people interested in medications and how we transform them. I'm there. Like at the end of the day, I think if you take away anything from me talking today, it's like I'm a big believer in technology. I'm practical around these things. I try to balance it between what's the research saying, what can we do clinically, and does this make sense for my patients at the end. I try to like bring that all together in my outlook. I am not going to just hype things up because it's like, oh, this is really cool. Yeah, it's cool, but does it have meaning right now? And meaning right now may not exist, but meaning in 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, 3 years could be there. Some people have been too early, but I think right now is very feasible with a lot of coming out of the post COVID. Like a lot of things, I think a lot of our expectations and viewpoints around the roles of technology in healthcare has really changed things. And I think for this topic, that's been good. At least I'll say minimally.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on, Tim. For those of you who have listened all the way till the end, don't forget I've been putting in Calendly links in the show notes for you all, my audience. I'd love to get to know you guys a little bit better, so feel free to schedule. And with that, thanks again for coming on, Tim. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.